Good morning, church family. The gospel this morning comes from John, chapter 12, verses 27 through 33. Now my soul is in turmoil, and what am I to say? Father, save me from this hour. No, it was for this that I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. A voice came from heaven. I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. The crowd standing by said it was thunder they heard, while others said, an angel has spoken to him. Jesus replied, this voice spoke for your sake, not mine. Now is the hour of judgment for this world. Now shall the prince of this world be driven out, and when I am lifted up from the earth, I shall draw everyone to myself. This he said to indicate the kind of death he was to die.
Beloved, I would like for you to reflect with me from the theme, Facing What Lies Ahead. Facing what lies ahead. We have all heard how valuable it is to think positively and to have a basic optimistic view of life. We know that difficult and even bad things happen in life that we somehow get through. To imagine and anticipate the worst that could happen fills us with anxiety and anticipated grief. We are wise to avoid always thinking negatively. Now, some people believe that when we think bad thoughts, we aid in bringing on the difficulties we are trying to avoid. There are some things that no matter what we do to prepare ourselves to face, we can never be fully ready, whatever that means, to address them. We are on our Lenten journey and approaching Holy Week and the story of the Passion of Christ, with its elements of tragedy and triumph. It is easier to cope with a sad story when it is about someone else rather than us. The gospel read from John today tells us yet of another time when Jesus spoke of his coming awful and heartbreaking end. He talked about it at times when his anticipation of it bothered him. He said in John's gospel, my soul is troubled. Later on, he was heard praying, Lord, let this cup pass from me. The death outcome of his suffering was only a part of what Jesus was referring to the many times he spoke of his dying. Now, it is normal for all of us to want to live as long and as well as we can. Can you imagine what it is like to be so devoted to something that you are willing to risk losing your life for it? Jesus was not as concerned about dying as he was about being committed to doing what he believed was God's will for his life and facing its consequences. There is, however, something else other than dying and the way he was crucified that qualified the death lament of Jesus. Whatever our rationale inhumanity, racism, sexism, homophobia, religious bigotry, political superiority, quests for power, you name it. It leads us to define people as worthy of death and death at the hands of other human beings. Perhaps you feel or have felt this way about someone. The difference between feeling or thinking this way about someone is that some people act on their belief that someone should die. I can imagine that those who survive their suffering or the death of a loved one caused by someone else might wish that the perpetrator's death be a part of their facing justice. It is always disappointing to me when I hear stories about what people have done to harm other people, how they distort the truth, how they deny and rationalize their harmful behavior. I am encouraged, however, because for every story of human-inflicted misery, there are more testimonies of people rising to defeat their horrors. They do so by facing the reality and truth of evil. Part of that truth and reality is that brutish behavior is embedded in our culture. Harmful behavior is in the norms of the culture of various institutions, agencies, and organizations in our society. A culture of brutality and prejudice, like DNA in the blood, is habitual memory and runs through the veins of America's history and actions. Now the trial, suffering, and death of Jesus on a cross were outcomes of what Jesus was willing to face. What laid ahead of him as the period of Lent and Holy Week prepares us to reflect upon was not just his death and death itself, but the brutality of humankind. The trauma story of the death of Jesus is about our capacity to inflict pain and death upon one another. Jesus was more committed to love and reform than he was afraid to die. He was saddened by what he knew human beings who disagreed with him were willing to do to silence his voice. He faced that difficulty with the faith he had in God. Now, we deal with whatever lies ahead with what we use to face everyday living. It is our commitment to living our best life each day rather than being preoccupied with our mortality to get us through our difficulties. It is having faith in God. It is having faith in ourselves. It is having faith in life itself by which we move forward. Jesus lived his life by the eternal truths that we are to reverence God and life. This truth can be in us as it was in him. You see, my friends, the hope of Easter is that we diminish our inhumaneness toward one another. Jesus is an exemplar for how our faith in God can help us to discern how to live a meaningful life and to keep both of life's adversities and celebrations from blinding us to the importance and power of having faith in God. Prophets and sages have brought this message to us as human beings since the beginning of time. The message that we learn to love God and our neighbor as ourselves may sound like an old and even naive, mushy, sentimental value. Yet each generation has to learn and be reminded of its truth. That truth is that we need to be aware that we did not create ourselves and that we are all members of one human race needing one another. Living according to these values are keys to us living in peace with ourselves and with one another. We may indeed measure ourselves and others by what we do, particularly when we are facing a crisis, as Dr. King so often said. Facing a crisis during a pandemic means not only dealing with the pandemic itself, but the weaknesses in ourselves and all of the other various ways of life that have contributed to the problems the pandemic exacerbates. These pre-existing conditions are intensified by our global health threat. Our lives are in each other's hands. To live centering just on ourselves can lead to our collective death. Although not facing the pandemic, the accusations of blasphemy and those who felt politically threatened by Jesus intensified their determination to destroy him. Death was a result of what Jesus had to face, our inhumanity toward one another. How did he face it? One might use the phrase of psychologists who calls the way in which Jesus faced tragic optimism. How does anyone face a challenge that threatens them and life? We face it, and when we face it by digging deeper into our inner strengths. We face what comes to us in life with who we are at the time of trial, with what we have learned from the past, and hopefully with the help of other people. This is what it means to face each day with integrity, to face it with the truth of who we are and to whom we feel we belong. We belong to one another, yes, and we belong to God. Sometimes we may have to dig deeper within ourselves to find whatever helps us to deal with life's challenges, to face what lies ahead. We, not just us as individuals, we collectively, we will get through whatever we are going through. This is the witness of the life of Christ. It is also our hope for the living of our days. It is our hope for not only the living of our days, but it is our hope for that which is beyond this time and this space. And for that we say, thank God.